Psalm 123. The Lord has chosen Zion, a song of ascents. Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you in the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy, for the sake of your servant David. Do not turn away your face of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath, from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne, if your sons keep my covenant, and my testimonies that I shall teach them. Their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. There I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. So what can be said of verses 1 through 5? It begins, remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob. I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. And so what could we say of this remembrance of David and his pursuit to find a place for the Lord? I think the thing that sticks out in my mind is that we remember David and we remember his pursuits because he attempted to bring or to establish an institution, perhaps a society that facilitated the dwelling place of God. That is, whether it be in the temple or in the broader society, through the values and customs that bind that society together. The human mind is oriented in such a way, the child and the children are raised in such a way, that the mechanism of the mind, the machine of the mind, is broader, it's more encompassing. It is able to see the light that is the unity of all things, the creator of things, the creator outside of our universe that gave us the ability to name the animals, to make sense of our reality that we find ourselves in. They gave us the very framework to improve our material condition, to inject divine principles into the earth, and to raise it into something that is useful for us, to raise it into something that is meaningful to us, that is sustainable long term, that provides us with love and happiness and fulfillment and joy and all this sort of stuff. And if David commits himself by Such discipline is not entering his house or going to sleep until he finds a place for the Lord. It is because this problem is so important that it requires constant work. Now, another interesting side note here is when the author references in verse 5, until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. Now, this reference to Jacob is a reference of commemorance, respect, that it draws our attention towards this important figure in Israel's history. This was a person that had deception in their life, that had struggled with God, and through their struggle, they came to a deeper understanding, a firmer foundation. And this foundation and this understanding led him to set aside the way that brought him to conflict prior with his brother. And through this new way, and I think through the profound understanding of his purpose, not only before but after he wrestled with God, after he was named Israel, he went on to establish these tribes of Israel. And in some sense, this can be seen as bringing God to these people, because the establishment of the tribes of Israel is a continuation in the progression of this society. It is making it more sophisticated. The tribes have their own responsibilities. The tribes continue to proliferate and grow like the branches on a tree, rather than wither and die. It is a successful pursuit. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jar. Now, Ephrathah is also known as Bethlehem. And I think what is being referred to here is not only a recognition of history, but also a symbol for what was to come. The importance of this place had some divine symbol to it. It had a divine quality that allowed glorious things to happen at that location. Now, Bethlehem would have been known to the authors at this time as the place of King David, the place where Jacob's wife, Rachel, was buried, and the place that the prophet of Micah prophesied that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And of course, we understand that this is the birthplace for Jesus Christ, which is the culmination of the divine into human form, into man. And so this place is the place of God, or for the Lord. Now, what does it mean for the modern day? Does a place continue to hold this responsibility of being God's land, God's place? I don't necessarily think so. I think at the time, given the context and given the culture, I think everything was right for this place to be sort of holy, to have these divine events occur. And through their occurrence, we are afforded the progression in our thought, a deeper relationship with God, a deeper understanding of truth. We found it in the fields of Jar. Now this is a likely reference to the Ark of the Covenant as it made its way through this land, as it stopped at this place. And the Ark of the Covenant was believed to have the presence of God associated with it. Now, of course, it requires the human mind to be present and to attribute such things to an object. And I think we have to be a bit careful about idolatry, even if the Ark contains important laws, important binding forces for our society. But nevertheless, wherever this Ark went, the place in which it was positioned was the land, or the place for God. And again, this would have been a place of profound insight, of reflection, of communal binding, all of this that unites people in such a way that they look up, that they wonder more, that they, instead of feeling a particular way or shying away from the burdens of their existence, they take their responsibility upon their shoulders to attempt to answer these questions. And in their attempt to answer them, they bring the divine down to us. They broaden the mind so that it can experience, so that it desires truth in whatever way that it finds it, whatever way it can secure it. Now this verse 6, is followed by, "Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool." And I like how the Psalms do this often. We find this sort of, in some sense, cryptic message. Behold, we heard it. We heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jar. There's a lot of bending and twisting that needs to be done to understand what happened there and the full detail of all that sort of thing. And it's buried somewhere where, we're 500 pages in, at least in this translation. And what happened at these places is buried somewhere in the Old Testament. We'd have to go back and find it. And so it can be kind of cryptic to understand exactly what that means. But once we understand that these were places that were devoted to God and that had some divine significance to it, then we can understand. Verse 7, "Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool." Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. So another way I might interpret verse 8 would be, "Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the divine law." And so in this way, it's a sort of a poetic recognition of what Israel wishes. That is, again, to have this place of God, a home in which the Lord can exist, the place from which Israel can drink, can fill themselves spiritually. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness. Of course, the priests and the saints must be clothed with righteousness and shout for joy. because these are the people that are closest to the resting place of God. They put in the most effort, they spend the most time, they are the most devoted, and as such, they have a particular authority. Doesn't mean that they're always right, but they have a particular authority because of the effort that they put in, the labor that they put in. And if they are not joyous, if they are not clothed in righteousness, then something is just not quite right, is it? Perhaps they don't quite understand. Or perhaps they need to take a step back. They need to return to their position after some deep contemplation and thought. For if one is to listen to this person of influence, and they are to come to the dwelling place of God, and they are to be fulfilled with the divine law, or the ark of God's might, as is written, this place must be free of deception, but more than just deception, because I wouldn't want to imply that there is a willing force that is at this location that wishes to pervert those that come to it, although that may be the case. But what I mean is that in the arrogance and the blindness and within the fallen nature of man, regardless of his position, whether it be a saint or whether it be a priest, it is important and fundamental to retain truth to such a degree that the common person can come to that same truth. And it is important that when one engages in a conversation, a good faith conversation, that not only do they both understand one another, but they come to some sort of agreement. Now this conversation can continue, and this agreement might be continually unfolding in terms of what it means. They may initially agree on bits and pieces, but once they establish a fundamental, or a fundament, I should say, the substrate from which they can both grow and proliferate, I think this reduces the likelihood of the priest not being clothed with righteousness and the saint being less than joyous. Now verse 10 doesn't quite make much sense to me. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. Now the anointed one is the one that is chosen. Is chosen perhaps to spread the message. Now he says, appealing to God for the sake of your servant David. Now David found favor in the eyes of God. And so for the sake of the individual that you had loved in a previous generation, or a previous state of our existence, in remembrance of that connection, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. Now I take back what I said about not understanding it. Now that I've read it, I understand it. I was misreading it. When it says, do not turn away the face of your anointed one, well, maybe I do have a problem with it. Let's see here. Do not turn away the face of your anointed one. Now the anointed one is like a David number 2, we could say, for ease of explanation. This is another individual that has the connection to the divine, that is in a position to do something, to make some change, and to improve the condition of the society and of the earth. And so, for God to turn away the face of the anointed one would be to lead people astray, would be to pervert their minds into something that is less true, that is less unified. Now this is an interesting thing to ask of God. I don't find any reason why the divine would do such a thing, would willingly commit an act of falsehood against someone that has been chosen by the source of being. But I suppose for the sake of hopefulness, that we can say, please don't turn away your anointed one from, please don't turn away the face of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath, from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne, if your sons keep my covenant and my testimonies that I shall teach them. Their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. And of course, this is fairly straightforward. It's a condition of alignment, and that if God has chosen this city and this people, if they do this, then they achieve the alignment. Now, they found the alignment under the rule of King David, and that's why I think they hold so strongly to it. Now, it's a pattern that I think is useful, even though it may be from a mind that was continually developing in that era. I think it's useful for continuing developing minds today. But we also must consider the broader context, because what Zion was then is different from what Zion is now, and the figure of David and his position in society may be different today than it was then. We have different governing structures. People live in different geographical locations then. There are Jews and Christians all over the earth, and not just at the location that is referenced here. And so the modern day is a bit more of an encompassing project than the old ancient world. Psalm 133, when brothers dwell in unity, a song of ascents of David. Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. Now this is a short and sweet psalm, but there's a lot of meaning packed into this. So it begins, behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down on the beard. So that beginning, what can we make of it? When brothers dwell in unity, and then there's the metaphor, it is like the precious oil on the head, running down on the beard. Now, the oil on the head refers to the act of consecration. Now, the ritual and the act itself, I think, these days has lost a lot of its significance and its meaning. But at one time it was imbued with such a vibrancy that I think if any traditions retain this practice, it does it well to make sure that its followers understand its purpose. And so what does it mean to consecrate something? My explanation for this is that first and foremost, it is a recognition. It's a recognition of a divide. It's the seeing of a boundary, in one sense, but it is also an opening and a lifting. So what do I mean by this? It means that when we consecrate somebody, or something perhaps, but in this case, somebody, when the oil is poured over their head, we are saying that this person is appointed, that they, just like we can take a block of wood, we can chop down a tree, and we can carve it up into a table, we can make a purpose, we can bring purpose to the material world, just as we can do this to earthly objects, we can do this to our fellow man. And when we do this to man, it is as if we are imbuing him with purpose, a higher level of purpose. And that purpose is to follow God, okay, first and foremost. But it is also a representation of an opening of the channel between this mundane earthly world and the divine world, the world that is imbued with meaning and purpose. And by doing so, we have a bridge between the earthly realm and the spiritual realm. And this allows and affords a certain type of connection between the two. Because when we are connected between the earthly and the spiritual, we can take from the spiritual, or accept from the spiritual, and give to the earthly. And when we do so, we find not only the table, but also the soul of man. We find these things enhanced. It is not a matter of the basic table. It is the purpose of the table. Now, of course, the more we understand the purpose of this table, I think the finer it will be designed. The more significance that we have for a table. Like, for example, something that people gather around to share a meal. That people come together to discuss important topics. The higher and the loftier our tradition and the purpose of gathering around this table will inevitably lead to us desiring a more beautiful table because of the loftiness and the significance that surrounds it. But this also applies to the soul of man. The loftier his soul, the greater the connection that he has with the spiritual realm. The greater connection that he has with the spiritual realm, the more beautiful his table will be. And it's this sort of cycle that I think is recognized within the act of consecration. Now it continues, on the beard of Aaron, this oil is flowing down, running down on the collar of his robes. Now if we take everything I said about this opening, the connecting of two realms, the spiritual and the earthly, Aaron, in terms of the historical significance, this was a person that really held together Israel as they left Egypt, who's responsible for constructing or maybe I should say, he's responsible for the organization of the Israelites and establishing the tabernacle along with his brother Moses. Now this tabernacle was the sanctuary, the place where the divine would come to rest among the people of the Israelites while they were on the move away from Egypt in the wilderness. It was their pillar around which they could remain grounded, so that the forces of nature and of temptation and of what have you, just the general symbol of the wilderness, the confusion, uncertainty, the anxiety, the potential destitution, the starvation, all of this. It was Aaron's responsibility, the anointed one, the consecrated one, to connect the spiritual realm to the earthly, to raise it. So now we have a purpose. Not only do we construct things out of the earthly environment, such as the tabernacle, to hold this divine principle, but it is through doing such things and bringing us together that we ourselves can be greater vehicles for this truth. And so I think this is why Aaron is mentioned here. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. Now here we have a further symbol of unity. This dew that nourishes and refreshes the plants and animals on the mountains. We see two symbols here, two different mountains. The dews of Mount Hermon, which can be seen as God's strength and His majesty, falling upon the mountains of Zion, which is man's holy city, in which the divine permeates down into. The mountains of Zion, of course, are the source of man's strength. And so we see this flowing down into, just like we described with the opening of the spiritual down into the earthly. It is the strength of the divine to the strength of man. The dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion, for there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. And that's quite interesting. Life forevermore. It is the promise of something that I can't quite put my finger on. This life, this existence, this way of the human mind to connect pieces of its reality and put it together to make sense of it. This sort of phenomenon is forevermore. Now, what it means for the future, I do not know. What it means for humanity, I don't know. But it is a very promising thing to think that life, in the fundamental sense of this putting together of the brothers that dwell in unity, of the mind that, again, brings in the factors of its reality and puts them together and puts their meaning and their drive into them so that they can live for their purposes and ultimately find purposes that are in line with the source of all purposes. Psalm 134. Come, bless the Lord, a song of ascents. Come, bless the Lord, all your servants of the Lord, who stand by night in the house of the Lord. Lift up your hands to the holy place and bless the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion, He who made heaven and earth. Psalm 135. Your name, O Lord, endures forever. Praise the Lord. Praise the name of the Lord. Give praise, O servants of the Lord, who stand in the house of the Lord. In the courts of the house of our God, praise the Lord, for the Lord is good. Sing to His name, for it is pleasant. For the Lord has chosen Jacob for Himself, Israel as His own possession. For I know that the Lord is great, and that our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all deeps. He it is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain and brings forth the wind from his storehouses. He it was who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and of beast, who in your midst, O Egypt, sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants, who struck down many nations and killed mighty kings, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan, and gave their land as heritage, a heritage to his people, Israel. Your name, O Lord, endures forever, your renown, O Lord, throughout all ages. For the Lord will vindicate his people, and have compassion on his servants. The idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak. They have eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, nor is there any breath in their mouths. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. O house of Israel, bless the Lord. O house of Aaron, bless the Lord. O house of Levi, bless the Lord. You who fear the Lord, bless the Lord. Blessed be the Lord from Zion, he who dwells in Jerusalem. Praise the Lord. So let's see what we can say of this psalm. Verse 7, I think, is particularly interesting. It is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain, and brings forth the wind from his storehouses. Now at its surface, to my mind, this verse is not immediately understandable. But after thinking about it for a little while, it begins to make sense. So first we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean for the clouds to rise at the end of the earth? What does it mean for the earth to have an end? Certainly from a materialist perspective, we understand that the earth, as a spherical object, has an end. It doesn't run in infinity. We could delude ourselves into thinking that the ancient people thought that the earth had such a geographical structure that once you reached a certain point, you reached the end of its form. But, as with many things in the Bible, we are talking from a spiritual perspective here, or rather I should say a totalizing perspective, with the spiritual in mind. So I think when they say that the clouds rise at the end of the earth, specifically the end of the earth, is to imply the point at which the material and the very base structure of reality, the sort of natural reality, without the intervention of the conscious mind or the divine mind. Now, it's a bit of a stretch to put it that way, but I think it's easier to conceptualize when we think of a material substance that is undisturbed by some mind, full stop, whether it be a divine mind or a human mind or some alien life form that has some elevated form of consciousness. Now, for this to end, for the earth to end, means that when we reach its end, we reach the point at which this base reality, this nature, everything within it that has been left untouched by some divine purpose, And that's not to say that the universe itself is not the cause of a divine purpose, but rather there are a few different levels I think we can consider here. If we say that the divine mind created the universe, we can also say that within our universe, this creation is given its own laws. And within the laws of this world, in this reality, there comes a point at which we reach its end. And what feeds back into this reality is something from outside. Now, of course, I think that it is entirely possible to have an emergent phenomena that mirrors the creator from the outside. So rather than being planted like a seed within the world for which he can grow and prosper, the universe itself could be a seed that grew and prospered and produced the image and the reflection of the divine mind. Now, these are two different approaches, I think, to understanding how the human mind came into existence, but it's neither here nor there for our purposes right now. What we are dealing with is a fairly basic pattern. That is just the differentiation between this earthly and the divine reality that floods in to give it intelligibility, to give it meaning, to give it purpose. In a sense, to raise it back towards and orient itself back towards the divine mind. And I would say that every act of raising material reality, and every act of usage of our world, if that makes sense, the usage of a table, the usage of a car, the usage of a weapon, in some sense these are all divine. Now, just because they are divine or they are elevated beyond this sort of base material level doesn't mean that they're right. They can most certainly be wrong. They could most certainly be evil. But the point is that it takes the base reality of nature and moves it for its own purposes. And so in verse 7, when it says, He it is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, I think the rising of these clouds, I'm sure this can be interpreted in many different ways, but what comes to mind immediately is that the cloud is something that floats above our earth, the solid ground upon which we stand. Now, regardless of the scientific explanation for the clouds and the earth and all this sort of thing, it really doesn't matter. We're talking about the meaning here. And so the clouds are sort of akin to this spirit, this level of organization within the human mind that can categorize, it can interpret, that can find meaning and purpose. It all sort of comes back to this. It can unify. And this cloud, when it reaches the end of the earth, when it understands that everything around it, everything that it perceives, is not all that there is, it is because of a divine influence that causes this separation, if you like. But perhaps it's not a separation at all. But there is a differentiation between the earth and the clouds that rise at the end of it. Because how can something rise at the end of our objective reality if there wasn't some broader framework outside of our known reality, which is within our universe, that operates based on a different set of laws? This is something that's not foreign to physics. I mean, you hear it all the time with the multi-worlds theory. or multi-universe theory, in which you have many different possible universes. Some of them can operate under entirely different laws. And so that's not to say to make a judgment about the correctness of that. I have no idea. But based on the biblical understanding, at the very least, we understand that there is something else outside of our known universe that is sort of out of reach of our tools of measurement, because what our tools measure exist and measure things that are based on the laws of the universe that we find ourselves in. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that we cannot understand that which is outside of the universe, but it means that we have to take a slightly different approach to understand it. And I think verse 7 does quite well in making this distinction between the earth and then the mind as it reaches the end of it. It comes into contact with God, and then the clouds are raised. Now the analogy continues, and it says, "Who makes lightnings for the rain, and brings forth the wind from his storehouses." Now these examples seem clearly to me to not explain natural phenomena. They're using the natural phenomenon to explain something philosophical, something for which the natural pattern there's no direction to the natural pattern. It's just a basic observation. So that in and of itself, the basic observation, does nothing. It tells us nothing. Of course, it tells us something about the nature and the behavior of lightning and rain. But in terms of our purpose, in regard to the human being at the center of this nature, it explains nothing. And so we have to, when we read the Bible, we have to think about it from the human perspective, because we are human beings. It doesn't mean we reject the objective way of understanding, but we cannot live our lives that way, because it doesn't mean anything. And we have to have meaning to survive. We have to have meaning to be in contact with God. We have to have meaning to unify things, to make sense of things, inevitably. If everything is objective and meaningless, I don't think that the human mind can function. Okay, so when we say God is the one that makes lightnings for the rain, we have to remember the human-centric, okay? So it starts with the human being. Of course, we can understand lightning for what it is, in the natural sense, but that's not the purpose of this description. God is who makes the lightnings for the rain. So we have to understand what the symbol of the lightning can be, and we have to understand what the symbol of the rain can be, and what it can mean for the human being. So let's start with the rain. From the human perspective, the rain is beneficial because it feeds our crops. It provides us with the very thing that we need to survive. Not only does it feed our crops, but rain and water more generally is a substance that we need to drink to survive. So this rain and the process of is a fundamental resource to the human being. It's invaluable in that sense. It allows him to maintain his existence in the natural world. Of course, it is one of the things that allows him to do so. Moreover, we can say that the rain is, the symbol of rain is not just water, right? Because we don't just say it is watering outside. Now, watering would even be more descriptive than just water, because watering is there's sort of an action there. There's a sense of a verb. but we have an entirely different word for it. It's raining. Now this raining has a particular method of action. It comes from a place higher, and it descends to a place lower. This is fundamentally the rain. And within the rain, we have what we've discussed, which is the importance to the human being, that it provides us with subsistence. It provides us with the ability to grow our food and nourish our bodies. So we have something that comes from above to below, and through this process of coming from above to below, we have the nourishing of the human being, of the body. Now it's interesting, it says, who makes lightnings for the rain. Now we think of the rain again as a process, of this sort of process that is this action. We have to close our eyes, we have to imagine what it means. We have to illustrate within our minds this space. We could say a darkened space. And then we can imagine some identifiable point. In my mind, I'm thinking of a line. And then we move inferior, and then we draw another sort of horizontal line. And now we have some direction. We have a verticality. We have the above line and the below line. And then we draw our mechanism, our rain, that is coming from the above line to the below line. And within the rain, again, is our enrichment through water, raising the body, maintaining the body. Now this lightning is for the rain. So I'm going to say this again. We zoom out, we have the process in general, or rather we have the vertical relationship, the high and the low. Then we have the process of rain, which descends from the high to the low. The rain itself is fundamental to the human being and for the human nourishment. Now if the lightning is to be subject to the rain, what does that mean? What can we say of lightning? Well, it is a powerful force. And it is also illuminating. So we have these two things, powerful and illuminating. So we have the powerful illumination of the very substance that fulfills, or that sustains, I should say, the human condition, the human body. And so it includes both this earthly element that needs to satisfy the natural laws that keep the human body within this reality and this existence, but it also brings the power and the light of the lightning into this subsistence, into this life, into this reality, so that this reality is more than just this perpetual cycle of growing our crops and drinking water to sustain ourselves. There's this power and light that shines in with it, that we can use the time that we have here for greater purposes. Now, what does this is the divine mind. It is God that does this. And the last analogy here is God brings forth the wind from his storehouses. Now the storehouse is where you keep something of value to use perhaps at a later date. A storehouse, I think of a place to store grain, to protect it from the elements. But when you have excess, you don't just throw it away. You keep it. It's the source of your subsistence. And in this way, just like the sort of the lightning is for the rain, and that it brings its power and its light down from the higher to the lower, the wind that comes from this storehouse, brings with it what is stored in that storehouse, which is the very thing that wind, of course, again, not the physical thing, not the nature that is the wind, the scientific wind, the objective wind, or air, or whatever its constituents are that make it up, but rather the spirit and the understanding that comes from this storehouse of the divine mind. He it was who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and of beast, who in your midst, O Egypt, sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants, who struck down many nations and killed mighty kings, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan, and gave their land as a heritage to his people of Israel. So what can we make of these series of verses here? You know, I don't wish to get lost in perspectivism. That is sort of the way of seeing or exploring the different ways of interpreting and ways of seeing. Because as I've discussed on previous episodes, if we get lost in perspectivism, if I take this bottle that's in front of me and I spend all day dissecting and analyzing what's before me, what's before my eyes, and then I slowly rotate this object around to reveal new observable things about this object that I could spend further days upon days upon days talking about. And I could almost, in a sense, do this for quite some time before I move on to another object. But in so doing, I failed to understand really the nature of the object, what is inside the object, what is inside this bottle. Now the analogy falls short a bit, because if it's purely an observation from a scientific perspective, the meaning is just not there. And so what I think has to be implied here is that the true meaning of something, if we are going to describe something, lies within it. Now again, we have to separate that from the observation of its material components, but not separate it entirely. It lies within our understanding of the object, but a more totalizing perspective, I believe, comes in when we discuss the depth of the object and how it is used, what purpose it serves, what it holds. And so this is why I bring up the case of the bottle, not necessarily because it's a random object that's in front of me, but because it has a particular purpose. It holds something within it. And so I say all that to say that the way I'm about to interpret some of these verses will differ from many that read these passages. And I think that the way to go about this, so that I and the people that interpret this differently don't get lost in translation, and that we are both after similar truth, I think at a certain point we are going to have to reach a level of conversation that forgoes certain potential pitfalls that come with the perspective approach. That is, if we dwell on the surface, if we look at the object from two different angles, but we fail to understand that this object is something for which its purpose is to hold something else, that we miss the point entirely. So, for the sake of faith, and good faith, in order to move forward, I would say that we should forego the perspective for now. Now, we can't do so entirely, of course, because I have to take a perspective, just as I have to take a road to get to my destination. But we have to, if one is to listen to the words that I say and value the meaning that is within it, we have to stay on this road together, so that we can get anywhere at all. So, that being said, verse 8, it was he who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and of beast. Now allow us to move down this path. Allow us to come to certain crossroads, but always allow us to continue our journey. What does it mean to strike down the firstborn of a nation, in this case, of Egypt? Now we could talk about the symbolic significance that the firstborn had held in that era. Now in ancient Egypt, the firstborn son held a special place or special status in the family unit. The firstborn son, was the successor to the father. The firstborn son was the one that was favored by the gods, and they had certain responsibilities. They were responsible for performing religious rituals on behalf of the family. The firstborn son was entitled to the inheritance, the family's inheritance. And so the death of this son, or the firstborn, meant that there would be, that the accumulated land, the accumulated wealth, the individual that performs the very behaviors that maintain the family unit and family sort of cohesive structure. I think of the religious duties as those that are sort of primary in maintaining this binding of the family. As the one who is to carry on this tradition that was previously held by the father of that family is to suddenly die, then we can imagine, in the broadest sense, that now, in terms of time, as we move, as our finite nature, unfortunately, or fortunately, who knows, decides that we must perish, our children are the things that continue what we have started. They are the supports of the structure that we have built throughout our lives. They serve as continual builders upon the thing that we value most. And within everybody's life, we all have something that we love dearly. We all have something that we want to protect and to cherish, and that we wish for its success in the future. The thing that lights the soul of man. And as this story unfolds within the heart of the individual and within the soul of the family, the scales all the way up to the level of the nation the nation of Egypt. And so I think if you were to suddenly have the death of the firstborn of all of the people of Israel, including that of the Pharaoh, I think we can imagine how devastating that would be to one's culture as this divine wave sets forth and prevents the continuation of the culture. How exactly that materialized, I don't know. But as sure as it implies that something happened, now of course it is wound up in saying that it was God who struck down these firstborn, and certainly I believe that. But exactly how that happened, I do not know, because I had to have obeyed natural law, and exactly how much time it took place for this to happen, I don't know. But in terms of generally speaking, I think it is obvious that the speed at which it happened was quite quick. And I say that because in the narrative, this happened over one night. Now, I'm sure that there were many of structural problems. There were a lot of chinks in the armor that had led up to the plagues of Egypt. And I think the force and the rapidity by which they happened created this divine significance. Because all of a sudden now, they face judgment. And in the face of judgment, in the face of true judgment, when you cannot turn to somebody and to appeal to them, when there's something out there that hovers beyond you and beyond your understanding that is judging you, the force of that weight must be incredible. And it's unfortunate that as a consequence of that judgment, human lives must suffer because of it. But this is the unfortunate state of nature. It's up to the human being to elevate himself to a point where we can avoid much of this. So we can come into union with God so that we are not judged as harshly. But it's not just freedom of judgment as the reason why we should pursue God. We pursue God to be fulfilled and to know and to be loved and to love others, or to be able to love others, to broaden the understanding of what it means to be a human being and what it means to have this gift of consciousness. He it was who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both man and of beast. So we've talked about the man in this scenario and the symbol that comes from that. But what can we say of the beast? Because it's not immediately obvious to us that the beast really has anything to do with the divine judgment. That is the divine judgment of man. So we can, just as we discussed before, we can take a few different paths to understanding why the beast is included in the divine judgment. Now, one possible explanation could be that this beast is a symbol for a source of food and of well-being, the sort of livestock scenario as a sort of storehouse of value, something that can continue the maintenance of the body that allows us to survive in this form. And so that's one way of seeing it. Another way, I think, we could think of the beast in more of a revelational sense. That this is something that is characteristic of an animal, which is why we call it a beast, that is void of certain characteristics of the human mind. This ability to think rationally, this recognition of the self, this ability to explore the finer abstraction, the abstraction of what is love, the exploration of how to temper one's desires and to properly order one's behavior so that it can lead to a successful order, so that it can imagine where its place is in the existence and in the world that it finds itself in. And I say world, I mean more of the inhabitable universe than I do of the earth in the material sense. Or more broadly, his place in the space of existence, his role in it. And the beast is something that is void of all of these characteristics. At least the typical beast that we can imagine that would be present in Egypt at the time, that was used for livestock, and the particular way that they were viewed, the cattle and the lamb and all of this sort of thing. And so on one hand, we have the destruction of the thing that maintains the bodily existence, right? We need the beast not only to sacrifice for ourselves so that we can continue to live and to thrive on. Again, it's the maintenance of the body. We also need it for work. We need its assistance, its power. But it is directed for our means, no doubt. And so in the absence of beast, we lose both. We lose the sustenance, and we lose the power for labor, the extra power. But then we lose the more significant. Well, actually, I should say it's not a loss. Well, it's a loss in a certain sense. But it is a good loss. It's a necessary loss. Perhaps why this whole thing started in the first place. That the thing that separates the beast from man I think at times can become blurred. That is, man can find himself in such a state of mind, although he has mind and he has the capacity for a greater understanding, for whatever reason and for whatever length of time that passes, that leads to a certain way of thinking, a dulling of the senses, a dulling of the mind, an incapability of maintaining one's proper composure, the inability of maintaining the family structure, the inability of the firstborn to carry the responsibility of their fathers, the inability of the fathers to live up to their forefathers, the sins of the father that led to the destruction of the firstborn, let's say. The behaviors that fundamentally darken the soul of man and his posterity is a sign of the beast, I think, in a sense, because it is void of all the characteristics that are necessary for the human being to be such to be the type of creature that lives for God. That the beast operates on very limited and primitive rules. They know nothing of the finer things. And for the human being to descend into the place where the beast occupies, I think it makes entire sense that along with this firstborn, if the spirit of the beast has permeated this society, has integrated itself into the Father, I completely understand why the beast would be killed. Because not only will the firstborn not be able to maintain the structure of society, maintain the sort of the understanding of agriculture, and of breeding the animals, of taking care of them, he will have no longer his eyes fixed upon the heavens. The heavens no longer drive his footsteps. His footsteps and his path becomes confused. Perhaps it becomes a never-ending cycle, sort of one of these paradoxes, like the two hands that are drawing each other, or the never-ending staircase. There is no intelligibility within that landscape. There is no way out of it. It's just this loop that they are stuck in. And when the destructive forces of nature come in, when change threatens its way of being, there's no answer for it. When they have to explain their behavior, there's no atonement. They don't know how to do it. And so in order for an individual, I think, to be saved in this environment that possibly could be swept over by the beast, it is a landscape of indignation, of insincerity. To be completely frank, it's a landscape that is not altogether different from that of the pit of Sheol. It's a type of hell, certainly. And it is such a powerful image, I think, this experience and God's intervention in Egypt. It would be certainly a shame to get lost in the perspective of this story for what it means. Who in your midst, O Egypt, sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants? And then we go into a few different patterns that are repeated about God striking down the nations that stand in the way of Israel from entering the promised land. Now, this is another difficult pattern to unpack here, because it's a militaristic type of God, let's say. The God is on the warpath to preserve a certain mind. But it's not necessarily God that is causing this warpath. I think it is man that causes the warpath. It is man that is not able to see the designs of another man in his arrogance, perhaps. He is unwilling to submit to the designs of another without considering what their designs truly are. And for good reason. The foreigner brings all sorts of dangers into a society. Changes way of seeing, pitfalls. But at the same time, the foreigner could bring the right answer. We can get lost in this perspective. We can look at this from the perspective of the Amorites. They view Israel as a hostile foreigner that wishes to change their way of being. We can look at this from the perspective of Israel, who believes they're on God's side, and that the land that the Amorites inhabit is their land. Now, of course, that if the Amorites wanted to believe in God and to believe in this way, then they could share in this prosperity, I suppose, as well. But I think there is a bit of a sin that's buried somewhere. I'm not quite sure where it is. I'm not quite sure if... I hesitate to say this, but given Israel's uncertain history, I think it's okay to say this. That although Israel may be God's chosen people, they may have designed a narrative inspired by the divine mind. They were not perfect. Their designs and the way they carried themselves, the execution of their grand plans, I think was not at all perfect. I think if we view the net result, what they accomplished and what they gave to the world, I think it was successful. But I think we always have to remember, even though that there were divine instances, certainly I can see God's hand over Israel. That much in my mind I think is clear. But we can't underestimate the failure and the fallen nature of man. The fail to accept the wisdom, the failure to look up at the appropriate times, or to look up at all times, and to never falter. And so there's something in me that it doesn't quite wish any different for what happened between Israel and the surrounding nations as they escaped from Egypt and attempted to regain or capture the land that they believed was promised to them. But I suppose I'm falling for a bit of my own trap, or my advice from earlier not to fall into, this matter of perspective taking. Because once we get lost in the value of another's perspective, then I think it shrouds the pursuit of the truth, of picking one perspective to find peace of mind and fulfillment of the soul. And so, although whatever path we choose may, on the surface, be completely understandable to us, it is our responsibility to accept that we have to walk this path to a complete understanding, and that it will never be within our capacity to understand all paths simultaneously. But as we move down this path, as we uncover more and more about different patterns of our reality, historical and otherwise, I think we begin to appreciate the paths of others, because there is value within their experiences. And when we engage with other people, we can learn from them and we can grow. Now, I think the ideal is that we want to have people that are generally from the same or similar, from a similar culture, from a similar tradition. So we all speak the same language. So that whenever we meet somebody, we're not retracing our footsteps, miles upon miles upon miles of footsteps. When we meet somebody, we sort of understand in general, their understanding, and then we can move from there. If it were the other way around, if we had to retrace all of their footsteps, if they had to retrace all of my footsteps, it would take much more to relate to somebody, I think. It would be much more difficult to be friends and neighbors with this person. Not to say that it's impossible, certainly it's possible. But the binding force is not as strong. Now, and herein lies another dilemma that the potential foreigner brings in. What if it is the case that what we are pursuing is not the same thing? That the ultimate source that we draw from is entirely different? Or that one doesn't believe in a source to draw from? What does this mean? What can be said of verses 15 through 18? The idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. Nor is there any breath in their mouths. Those who make them become like them, so all who trust in them. Now this is something that has been repeated in earlier Psalms, but it's a very important and very profound passage. Because in the case of, and this applies to many things, not just to to those that make idols out of gold and silver. It's to those who make idols in general. I think this is why it's a commandment. That is, a commandment not to worship false idols. But what I want to talk about with reference to these verses is what exactly does it mean to make an idol out of gold and silver? I think more fundamentally, what does it mean for something to be an idol? And then even more fundamentally, what does it mean to worship an idol? And from that, what does it mean to worship, and why is worship necessary? I think all of these sorts of things are necessary to understand the consequences of producing an idol that represents gold and silver. So let's begin with the bare bones, so to speak, what it means to worship. Now, my idea of what worship is perhaps not very sophisticated. I've yet to find a church and a community of people that sort of inhabit the path that I'm seeking. Now that might seem and sound arrogant, and it probably is, but I also have not had very many experiences in many different churches. I've had a few, but largely I've remained this sort of individualistic worshiper, which I have noticed, I have observed, it causes some distress. It is incomplete as a practice, and at some point it does need to be fixed. But for the moment, I would like to talk about worship, even though my description may not be all that sophisticated. It is important to establish what worship is, so that we can move forward with the broader conversation of idolatry. So, worship is something that means to give reverence, honor, or devotion to something, to an object, to a god or an idea. That is something that is held to be sacred or divine. Now, the forms that this worship takes are multivariate, multifaceted. It's almost endless. Now, there are countless traditional examples. As in church, we congregate together, we sing songs, we talk from the Bible, Perhaps we go to a class afterwards to continue the discussion about a particular book, a particular chapter, a particular verse, whatever have you. But there are many ways to worship. I view exercise, intense physical exercise, as a form of worship. Again, there are ways to integrate this, I think, into something that is more social and less individualistic. But this is one of the ways that we can direct our efforts and our cause for devotion to something that is beyond ourselves. But there are two key things here that remain, I think, fundamental to worship. It is, what do you worship and how do you worship? Both are important. Because there are forms of worship, undoubtedly, that remain outside of the social experience, void of the interaction with others, that on one hand provides some focus on the internal self, but on the other hand it has potential dangers of inflating the self and disengaging with others. And the engagement of others is necessary. It's fundamental in a society. If the society itself has poor social bonds, through poor social practices and tradition, and shared worship, I think that this is a net negative. What we worship is also extremely important. We could worship our face flat into the face of the earth if we're not careful. There are many different things that we can deify, that we can bring down from some divine sphere and place it into an object, like silver or gold. And yet it is fundamentally not directed anywhere. It does nothing by itself. It's just sort of trying to shove a spirit into a body that is not built to hold it. It just doesn't make any sense. Moreover, from the part of making sense, I think that attributing false worship or attributing worship to a false idea can lead one to walk the path that deviates from truth. I mean, it's not a very complicated problem, but the problem of finding truth is a difficult problem. So there needs to be a rich form of worship. There has to be a sophisticated understanding of what to worship. So again, that we don't fall on our faces, and we don't plug our head into the sand, so to speak, so that whatever remains above the sand, whatever human being remains above the sand, walks around in disbelief that people would actually submit themselves to such a state of depravity, and then they just sort of capitalize on the situation through everybody's blindness and deafness and so forth and so on. And they create their own institutions that seek to control others. And so it's a potential danger. In that sense, it's a potential danger to the individual as much as it is to the collective. Now, idols are representations. Now, these representations serve as the focal point of worship. These idols are often attributed to objects, and unless, I think, at the risk of sounding disrespectful, at less refined societies, these objects contain divine significance in their own right, and that there is something inherently, almost in some cultures, in some primitive cultures, the object itself is the divinity, and the destruction of that object is it can be seen as a dangerous thing, a sin, what have you. Now, I would say that not all physical representations of the divine are sinful. I think there is a important place for art in our society and our culture, but it's really important that we understand as a society that that it does matter what we represent as our art, especially in a free society where we have the freedom to do as we please in terms of our artistic pursuits. If we go too far down the wrong path, we create an influence and a following that is significant, it's sizable. Perhaps we create a unique little movement within our space of artistic exploration, and yet it is insufficient to raise everybody up with the action or the product that is produced by the artist. Then we are wasting time, in a sense. We are failing as a culture and as a tradition. There needs to be a lot of insight and philosophical exploration, a depth of thought that goes into producing adequate art. And I think good art, not all art, but certainly many forms of art that are considered to be good, bring the viewer on a story. It describes something about us, about our reality that we immediately find salient. Now, I think some of this has to do with the landscape that we find ourselves in. There are certain patterns and modes of existence that I think the ancients had to deal with that were a bit different than the patterns and modes of existence that we have to deal with today. The fundamental patterns probably remain the same, but the way that they're represented and the stories that encapsulate the meaning that is salient to the reader or the audience, I think this changes, this morphs. And so to get back on topic, we're talking about worship, we're talking about idolatry, and we're talking about what to worship, how to worship, and what is worship. So to return to these verses here, the idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak. They have eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear. Nor is there any breath in their mouths. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. Now, what can we say about the idols of the nations being gold and silver? Why would it be that the nations idolize gold and silver? A few examples come to mind here, or rather I should say a few reasons come to mind here. In the case of gold and silver, these are metals that are fundamental elements. They are rare to find. When they are found, they are resistant to erosion and decay, so they last a long time. And I think this rarity, the fact that they are uncommon, it creates a sense of value to them. Certainly that accompanied to the resistant element. If you have something that is rare and resistant to the change of nature and the forces of nature, then I think the human being inherently finds this valuable. Because in a religious sense, the element will transcend the life of the human being, the life of the individual. In some sense, this is sort of a deity, especially if you store value in something that lasts longer than the life of the individual. But it still remains a material object. It remains something that is fundamentally bound by the laws of nature, something that is fundamentally the creation of a more divine whole, divine unity. And if we are to bow our heads to such an extent as to worship something so earthly, I think the consequences of which will be sort of earthly consequences. They are the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. Nor is there any breath in their mouths. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. And so this storehouse of value, it cannot store the richness of the human mind and the human soul. It can store a certain type of value, but it's not a very elevated sense of what value is. It's valuable in the sense that we've discussed, that it is, we didn't mention this, but it's nice to look at, so it could be ornamental. It's nice to look at, it's resistant to erosion, and it's rare in nature to find. But if this is what your God is going to be, that you worship something that is uncommon, that you worship something that is resistant to change, okay, that sort of makes sense. That might be a good quality to have. However, even though there is a posterity component, I think, wound up in it with the resistance to change, I think fundamentally why we desire these objects is that we understand that they can provide us with a stable, secure sense of value. But it's bound to the material world. It can only be used for material purposes. So that is every act of worship, every time we go to the temple or the church, mosque, whatever, and we worship this thing that is sort of unchanging, it's beautiful, and it's reliable. Okay, good qualities. But it's stuck within a very sort of adolescent phase. It's the reflection of the divine image is attributing to a material object, which is the result of some divine creation, a divinative status in and of itself. And I think that this raising of the object to the status of the divinity without recognition of the divinity that lies beyond it is dangerous, and it's a sin, because it tethers the human mind to the earth in such a way, well, I should say it in this way. We will probably always be tethered to the earth in some respect, but what I would like to mean is that we are tethered to this object, and the roof that is over our heads descends in terms of its height, and so our capacity to look up beyond the object is limited. And like I said, we can recognize certain values that it has, but the object itself is just the object. It can have those qualities, but in terms of the thing beyond the object, there's no recognition of it. In terms of the thing that is the source of that object, there is nothing. We just find the echoes of the source and of the qualities that was given to it that we are allowed to perceive through its nature. But in fact, what we find is a mouth that does not speak, and eyes that do not see, ears that do not hear. There's no breath in their mouths. And those who make these idols, they become like them, and so do all who trust in them. And so I think this is as characteristic of the individual that worships these idols as the idols themselves. You know, what is man with a mouth but that does not speak? And here I don't refer to literal speech. I mean speech that is meaning. You know, speech that provides meaning. Speech in this context is really anything that can convey the type of knowledge and meaning and of reason that is sort of characteristic of the human mind. That is ultimately the reflection of the divine mind. And so to worship something that has all of these sense organs but has really no true value to it, then the thing itself cannot be worshipped as a god or a deity. Now, that's not to say that it does not have value, because we said that it has certain values that are intrinsic to its nature. And as far as that is concerned, it can be used as a tool of man, just like a hammer can be used as a tool to build a house. It has intrinsic value to it. It adds productive force to our ability to use our upper extremity to swing the limb, to hit a hard object into another hard object, thereby securing it together. It's formed in such a way that can adequately drive a nail through wood. And so, in as far as that's concerned, it's a useful tool. But we don't worship the tool, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to build the house. There's nothing about the tool that gives us the divine inspiration to use it. The divine inspiration is the thing that is above the tool that gives us the inspiration to actually use it. So if we want to use gold and silver as a storehouse of value for our economies, we have to understand that this is something that we use because we understand something greater. We understand something about its nature to be used as a tool, sure, but you have to, or perhaps I should say, I have to understand that if we are to extract these patterns out of nature, again, to repeat something that I've said frequently about the nature of gold and silver, that it's something that is durable, it's resistant to erosion, it's beautiful, and it's rare. These patterns are recognizable by the very fact that we are the reflection of the divine image. And so if we are a reflection of the source of all intelligibility, then because we can see the patterns that are associated with material objects that become useful to us, we then have to give this up to God, to the source of it all, to the source of being. Now we can sacrifice it up to the higher source of being, so we can sacrifice it for a greater good, or we can use it for a greater good, let's say. But again, this idea of idolizing something that has basic patterns of reality, of natural reality within it, is very premature. It's a sort of an adolescent way of understanding physical objects, it would seem, because it restricts your motion. And why would you sacrifice the freedom of thought and freedom of motion to something that is basic? It's something that is sort of a primitive pattern, something that is not sophisticated, something that does not unify a body together. It's just, again, a useful tool. But by itself, the tool, again, just like the hammer, does not build the house. It doesn't bring everything together into a cohesive whole. So I'm going to end this episode here. Next episode, we will begin with His steadfast love endures forever, Psalm 136.